Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the border between the United States and Mexico isn't just a line on a map. It's a living, breathing artery, pulsing with ambition, temptation, and danger. Imagine the southern sun melting into the horizon, the sound of cicadas filling the warm Texas air, and somewhere out there, a young man already restless with a life too small for his appetite. That young man is Edgar Valdez Villarreal, a boy who will one day be called La Barbie, a name whispered in fear and fascination across two nations. You probably won't survive this story if you think you can coast through it. Edgar's world is sharp, full of choices that slice deep, and the stakes? Everything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, let me know your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Edgar's story begins not in the shadow of cartels or drug empires, but in the tidy neighborhoods of Laredo, Texas. It's the kind of place where Friday night football is a religion, and families drive trucks big enough to carry their dreams in the back. Born in August 1973 to a middle-class Mexican-American family, Edgar seemed to fit the mold. He was tall, blonde, and strikingly blue-eyed, features that would later earn him the nickname La Barbie from his cartel peers, because he looked less like a stereotypical gangster and more like a Mattel doll. But back in those early days, his life wasn't a caricature. It was ordinary, almost painfully so. Edgar was a bright kid, smart enough to skate through school without trying too hard, but he wasn't the type to stay buried in books. He wanted action, the thrill of something bigger than what his hometown could offer. He spent hours on the football field, a standout linebacker at United High School, crashing into opposing players with a ferocity that earned him respect. There's a famous photograph, yellowed at the edges, of him hoisting a helmet after a homecoming win, a wide grin splitting his face. It's strange to look at it now, knowing where that energy would be funneled later. But football wasn't enough. It never was. Even as a teenager, Edgar had a restless streak, a gnawing belief that he was destined for more than clocking in at a 9-to-5 job. That belief, mixed with a curiosity about the easy money trickling up from Mexico, would prove dangerous. Small-time hustles, selling weed to classmates, connecting friends to low-level dealers, started as side gigs, the kind of thing plenty of teenagers flirt with and walk away from. But Edgar didn't walk away. He kept going. The southern border was only a few miles away, a reality that shaped Laredo in quiet, profound ways. Drugs, contraband, and cash flowed like unseen currents. And for an ambitious young man, opportunity was everywhere. Some of his older friends whispered about jobs ferrying packages across the river. Quick work for quick cash. Edgar listened carefully. He didn't leap right in, but the idea lodged in his mind like a seed. Why settle for minimum wage when there were people making thousands for a single trip? At home, his family sensed the shift. He was still the same charming son and brother, but his eyes carried a sharper edge. His mother once asked him why he was staying out so late. "Working," he'd answer, and she'd sigh, sensing more but unsure how to pull it out of him. Fathers and mothers in towns like Laredo know the lure of the border all too well. They hope their children won't fall into its undertow, but many do. The early 90s were a turbulent time for Mexico and its cartels. The Gulf Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, and the Sinaloa Cartel were battling for dominance, carving up territories in brutal, bloody wars that often spilled over into U.S. border towns. Edgar didn't fully grasp the geopolitical storm brewing just a few miles south, but he knew one thing. The people running those operations lived lives he couldn't even dream of. Mansions, cars, respect, the kind of respect that comes from fear. One mainstream historical fact to keep in mind: during this same period, U.S. Customs Service agents were intercepting record amounts of cocaine at border crossings, sometimes seizing over 70 tons in a single year. That gives you a sense of the scale of the trade and of how many shipments still made it through undetected. Edgar saw those headlines and didn't think about law enforcement's victories. He thought about the sheer volume of cash floating through his backyard. Many people still think that Edgar's criminal career was inevitable, that a boy with his charisma and daring was always going to be drawn to the cartels. But was it truly inevitable? Or could a different set of choices, a mentor steering him toward college football or a steady job, have changed everything? So what do you think? Edgar's high school years ended with more questions than answers. He didn't have the grades or connections to land a scholarship, and the idea of working a regular job felt suffocating. He started spending more time across the border, dabbling in circles that were riskier and richer than anything he'd known before. He wasn't yet Barbie, feared sicario and cartel lieutenant, but the foundations of that identity were being laid, one small decision at a time. As he drove the familiar roads of Laredo at night, headlights slicing through the dark, Edgar couldn't have known that the same hunger pushing him forward would eventually make him a target for the world's most powerful law enforcement agencies. Back then, it was just ambition, tinged with a thrill he couldn't shake. Edgar's life after high school could have followed the pattern of many of his classmates. Find a steady job, settle down, and watch the seasons roll by in Laredo. But Edgar wasn't wired that way. He had tasted what easy money felt like during those small-time hustles in his teenage years. And once you feel that weight of crisp cash in your pocket, a minimum wage paycheck starts to seem like an insult. He still had the frame and speed from his football days, but without the structure of the team or school, those energies went untamed, roaming in search of something more dangerous and more rewarding. He started by expanding the small drug deals he'd once treated like side projects. No longer just passing a bag of weed here and there, Edgar stepped into the role of a middleman, connecting Mexican suppliers with American buyers. The location of Laredo made it almost too easy. With Interstate 35 running straight up to San Antonio, Austin, and beyond, Edgar could move product north without drawing much attention. The money came fast, and faster still came the temptation to scale up. He kept up appearances at home. To his family, he was just Edgar, charming, handsome, and helpful when he wanted to be. But beneath that polished exterior, he was building connections across the border that would one day catapult him into the higher ranks of organized crime. Friends from those days remember how he carried himself. He was confident, magnetic, and seemed to command any room he walked into. That charisma would become one of his greatest assets, allowing him to charm not only associates, but also women, rivals, and even the occasional law enforcement officer. Yet it wasn't just charm driving him forward. Edgar had a relentless work ethic when it came to hustling. He was meticulous about his operations, demanding that every deal run smoothly. That attention to detail made him stand out from other small-time dealers, many of whom were reckless or sloppy. He knew how to talk his way out of a bad situation, but he also knew how to avoid putting himself in one in the first place. Still, the risks grew with the rewards. Law enforcement was no stranger to Laredo's drug scene. Every few weeks, headlines announced new busts, kilograms of cocaine seized at the border, networks of dealers dismantled. It was a reminder that the path Edgar was on wasn't just dangerous because of rival gangs. The authorities, both local and federal, were watching. He managed to dodge serious trouble at first, but minor brushes with the law were inevitable. A traffic stop that revealed a small stash. A suspicious vehicle parked too long at a friend's house. Each incident was a warning shot, but Edgar brushed them off with the confidence of someone who believed he could outthink the system. Around this time, a nickname began to stick. He'd always stood out for his appearance: light skin, blonde hair, and those piercing blue eyes. In a world dominated by darker complexions, Edgar looked like he had stepped out of a toy catalog. Someone jokingly called him La Barbie, and the name spread quickly. At first he hated it, thinking it sounded soft, but the more people used it, the more he embraced it. It became part of his brand, a paradox that made him even more memorable. Here was a man who looked like a doll, yet his growing reputation in the underworld was anything but delicate. His ambition eventually outgrew the small networks he was working within. The money was good, but Edgar wasn't interested in being a minor player forever. Word spread about the cartels in Mexico. The Sinaloa cartel, in particular, was making waves with its sophisticated operations and international reach. Stories of their power and wealth fascinated Edgar. He understood that if he could align himself with a major organization like Sinaloa, the ceiling on his earnings and influence would shatter. One mainstream historical fact from this period underscores how attractive the cartels seemed to young men like Edgar. In the late 1990s, Mexico's drug trafficking revenues were estimated at over $10 billion annually. That kind of money didn't just buy luxury cars and mansions. It bought entire towns, politicians, and entire police forces. For someone with Edgar's ambitions, the allure was undeniable. Many people still think that Edgar's decision to pursue a relationship with the cartels was purely about greed. But could it also have been about identity? About wanting to belong to something bigger than himself? The debate remains. Some argue he was simply opportunistic. Others suggest he was drawn to the sense of power and purpose the cartel world seemed to offer. So, what do you think? Could he have been chasing more than money? As Edgar expanded his operations, he started spending more time in Mexico, especially in areas where the Sinaloa cartel held influence. He proved himself capable of moving product across the border reliably, earning the respect of mid-level cartel contacts. These trips were dangerous, yet Edgar seemed to thrive in the risk. He quickly learned the unspoken rules of survival in cartel circles. Loyalty was currency, respect was mandatory, and betrayal could get you killed. He also began to adopt the lifestyle that came with his rising income. Expensive clothes, flashy jewelry, and nights out in Mexico's hottest clubs became part of his routine. It was a dangerous sort of visibility, the kind that made him stand out even more to law enforcement. But Edgar wasn't interested in blending in. He enjoyed the status that came with being La Barbie. He had power now, and he wanted people to see it. This period in Edgar's life marked a turning point. He was no longer a local hustler with big dreams. He was becoming a serious player in the world of cross-border drug trafficking. The decisions he made during these years would set the stage for everything that came next. The alliances, the betrayals, and the violence that would eventually define his name in history. As he drove back to Laredo after one of his Mexico trips, headlights carving through the quiet highway, Edgar couldn't shake the feeling that he was destined for something monumental. He wasn't just chasing money anymore. He was building a legend. What he didn't realize was that legends often come with a price, and his would be steep. Edgar Valdez Villarreal's hustle was no longer a secret, at least not to those who paid close attention. The streets of Laredo whispered about his movements, and even his family, though they rarely confronted him directly, couldn't ignore the subtle but unmistakable signs that their son was walking a dangerous path. He was buying things that didn't match any kind of normal income. Designer clothes, gold chains, and a new car that made heads turn. When asked where the money came from, Edgar would flash that disarming grin and say something vague about business opportunities. But business opportunities had already begun catching the attention of law enforcement. Small arrests here and there added up, painting a picture of someone who wasn't just dabbling in illegal activity. One night, while driving back from San Antonio, Edgar was pulled over for a routine traffic stop. An officer noted the faint smell of marijuana and asked him to step out of the vehicle. The search didn't uncover much, just enough to result in a citation, but the experience was a reminder that even a small slip could lead to serious consequences. He left the scene more cautious, but he didn't slow down. The truth was, Edgar felt invigorated by risk. That brush with the law only reinforced his belief that he could handle the pressure. He began expanding his network, forming connections not just with other local dealers, but with suppliers who operated deeper inside Mexico. He had started to make trips south of the border with increasing frequency, and each trip broadened his understanding of the drug trade's scale and sophistication. It was during one of these trips that Edgar first got a taste of cartel culture up close. He was introduced to a group loosely affiliated with the Sinaloa cartel, the powerful syndicate led at the time by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Edgar was captivated by what he saw. These weren't ragtag criminals scraping by. These were men who moved like businessmen, complete with armed bodyguards and fleets of expensive vehicles. They commanded entire territories, and their influence reached all the way into government offices. Cartel life carried with it an undeniable allure. At one gathering, Edgar observed how mid-level bosses were treated almost like royalty, their words carrying weight and their presence eliciting instant respect. He knew then that he wanted to be part of that world. It wasn't just the money, though that was considerable. It was the power, the ability to make decisions that shaped the lives of others. Back in Laredo, Edgar began using what he'd learned to refine his own operations. He tightened his supply lines, ensuring that drugs flowed north with minimal disruption. Cocaine had become his primary product, and he moved it with a precision that impressed his contacts. He was ambitious, yes, but he was also disciplined. Unlike some who flaunted their power recklessly, Edgar understood the value of discretion. Still, he couldn't hide his success completely. Flashy purchases became part of his identity. He rolled through town in a shiny Cadillac Escalade with custom rims, a bold statement in a city where most people drove pickup trucks. Friends who knew him back in high school marveled at his transformation. He wasn't just Edgar anymore. He was Barbie, the guy everyone wanted to be around. Yet, with notoriety came danger. Rival dealers in Laredo saw him as a threat, and tensions occasionally spilled into violence. Edgar learned to move with caution, changing routines frequently and always keeping an eye on who was following him. He also began carrying firearms, a habit that would later become second nature. One mainstream historical fact from this era illustrates how precarious Edgar's life had become. In the early 2000s, homicide rates in Mexican border cities like Nuevo Laredo spiked dramatically as cartels fought for dominance. These were not quiet power struggles. They played out in broad daylight with brazen shootings and public executions. Edgar, who often conducted business just across the border, had to navigate this minefield carefully. Many people still think that Edgar's brush with law enforcement during these early years should have scared him straight. After all, plenty of young men caught with drugs decide it isn't worth the risk and walk away. But Edgar seemed almost emboldened by the challenges. Was it arrogance? A sense of invincibility? Or was it simply that he had already glimpsed a life too grand to give up? So what do you think? As Edgar grew more entrenched in the drug trade, he started cultivating a reputation for loyalty and reliability, two traits that carried immense weight in cartel culture. He didn't just move product, he solved problems. When a shipment was delayed at a border crossing, Edgar found alternative routes. When a rival dealer tried to undercut prices, Edgar's network applied pressure until the threat disappeared. These skills didn't go unnoticed by the Sinaloa cartel, and soon, whispers began circulating that Barbie was someone to watch. By his mid-20s, Edgar was no longer a local hustler. He was a rising figure whose operations spanned state lines and international borders. He hadn't yet reached the upper echelons of the cartel hierarchy, but the foundation was set. One day, as he stood on a quiet overlook in Nuevo Laredo, gazing down at the city lights shimmering on the Rio Grande, he allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to truly be in charge. That vision, intoxicating and dangerous, would guide every decision he made from that moment forward. Edgar Valdez Villarreal had a knack for making introductions matter. He understood that in the world he was inching into, who you knew often meant more than what you did. By his late 20s, Edgar was traveling deeper into Mexico, spending time in places like Sinaloa, Durango, and Sonora, territories that formed the beating heart of the drug trade. Each trip brought him closer to men whose names carried real weight: lieutenants, plaza bosses, and occasionally, whispers of those who sat at the very top. It was during these years that Edgar's relationship with the Sinaloa cartel solidified. At first, he was merely a dependable logistics player, someone who could move cocaine from Mexico into Texas without attracting unwanted attention. But as he proved himself again and again, he was entrusted with more. He developed direct relationships with mid-level bosses, and eventually, he was introduced to figures like Arturo Beltran Leiva, a ruthless yet charismatic leader whose connections and resources dwarfed anything Edgar had seen before. Arturo, known as El Barbas for his distinctive beard, was one of the most feared and respected men in the Sinaloa cartel at the time. He operated with the perfect balance of charm and brutality, an approach Edgar admired and adopted in his own dealings. The two men clicked almost immediately. Edgar's charisma and ambition reminded Arturo of his younger self, while Edgar admired Arturo's ability to command respect with a single look. This connection would change Edgar's life forever. Edgar began running increasingly large shipments under Arturo's direction. Tons of cocaine would make their way through secret routes, often hidden in commercial trucks or carried by mules willing to risk everything for a cut. Edgar's operations were precise, and the profits astronomical. By now, he was living a life that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Luxurious mansions in Mexico City and Acapulco, expensive cars, parties with politicians and celebrities. Edgar had arrived, but this level of success carried new dangers. The Mexican government, under pressure from the United States, was ramping up its war against the cartels. In 2001, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, escaped from a maximum security prison, an event that embarrassed authorities and triggered a renewed focus on dismantling cartel networks. This crackdown meant that Edgar had to move carefully. He also had to contend with rival groups. The Gulf Cartel and its paramilitary enforcement arm, Los Zetas, were gaining power, carving up territories with savage efficiency. Edgar, who had grown accustomed to operating with relative freedom, now faced challenges at every turn. His convoys risked ambushes. His allies worried about betrayal. Each move he made had to be calculated not just for profit, but for survival. This period in Edgar's life marked his full immersion into cartel culture. He was no longer dabbling. He was an integral part of an organization that spanned continents. Yet he retained a certain American swagger, a willingness to stand out that both impressed and irritated his Mexican counterparts. They respected his ability to generate profit, but occasionally questioned his flashy persona. One mainstream historical fact illustrates how dangerous these years were. By 2005, Mexico's drug violence had escalated so dramatically that some border cities resembled war zones. Homicide rates soared, and mass graves became chillingly common. For Edgar, who was frequently on the move, every trip carried the risk of crossing paths with the wrong group at the wrong time. Many people still think that Edgar's relationship with Arturo Beltran Leyva was one of mutual loyalty, but others argue that it was a marriage of convenience. Did Arturo truly see Edgar as a trusted protege, or was he simply using him as a valuable asset? So what do you think? Was Edgar genuinely part of Arturo's inner circle, or was he always on the outside looking in? Either way, Edgar thrived. He had learned that violence could be a tool as much as money, and he wasn't afraid to use it when necessary. Stories began to circulate about his willingness to make examples of those who crossed him. One associate recalled how Edgar ordered the punishment of a driver who had lost a shipment, a decision that left everyone in the organization with no doubt about his resolve. At the same time, Edgar cultivated an image of generosity with those loyal to him. He paid well, supported families, and threw lavish parties that reminded everyone of the rewards that came with his patronage. This combination of fear and loyalty became his signature style, a strategy that mirrored Arturo's own approach. Back in the United States, Edgar kept a lower profile. He maintained connections in Texas and Atlanta, where his operations supplied vast amounts of cocaine, but he rarely lingered too long in any one place. He understood that law enforcement's net was widening and that any slip could land him in prison, or worse. As Edgar stood at a gathering in Acapulco one evening, sipping expensive tequila, while a band played narco corridos celebrating cartel exploits, he could feel the power he had amassed. He had come a long way from Laredo's football fields, and the stakes had never been higher. He was now a key figure in one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. But with power came envy, suspicion, and the ever-present possibility of betrayal. Edgar, who had always believed he could outthink his enemies, would soon discover that the higher you climb in the cartel world, the sharper the knives waiting for you at the top. By the time Edgar Valdez Villarreal was firmly embedded in the Sinaloa cartel's operations, his nickname, La Barbie, was known far beyond the border towns. Journalists would later marvel at how a man who looked so unassuming, blonde, blue-eyed, and often impeccably dressed, had become one of the most feared enforcers in Mexico's drug war. But among his peers, there was no mystery. Edgar had proven himself time and again as someone who could get the job done, no matter how risky or brutal the assignment. Arturo Beltran Leyva trusted Edgar with responsibilities that would have crushed lesser men. He oversaw massive cocaine shipments, negotiated with suppliers in Colombia, and kept operations running smoothly in volatile territories. But Edgar wasn't just a logistics guy. He was becoming a strategist, someone who understood that power wasn't only about moving product, it was also about managing people, allegiances, and perceptions. One of Edgar's strategies was building a network of lieutenants who were fiercely loyal to him personally, not just to the cartel. He knew that in the world he inhabited, alliances shifted like desert sands, and survival often depended on who would stand by you when things got ugly. These lieutenants, many of whom had grown up underprivileged and desperate, saw in Edgar not only a boss, but a provider. He paid them well, looked after their families, and rewarded success lavishly. It was a calculated move, ensuring that his inner circle would think twice before betraying him. Edgar also began to experiment with public image, something few cartel members cared about. He sponsored local soccer teams, donated money to churches, and handed out gifts during holidays. In places like Acapulco and Cuernavaca, where he spent significant time, some locals viewed him as a benefactor. It was an old trick, one employed by crime figures around the world. Buy goodwill, and people will be less likely to talk when the authorities come asking questions. But the violent side of Edgar's operations was never far from the surface. He became known for sending clear and terrifying messages to rivals. Stories began to spread of his willingness to decapitate enemies and display their bodies publicly. Acts designed to strike fear deep into anyone thinking of crossing him. This ruthless reputation wasn't just for show. It was survival. In a world where weakness could get you killed, Edgar projected strength at every opportunity. One mainstream historical fact about this era underscores the brutality of the drug war. By 2006, the Mexican government, under President Felipe Calderón, had deployed thousands of soldiers to fight the cartels, sparking a wave of violence that claimed tens of thousands of lives in the following years. Edgar's operations were directly affected. Soldiers raided safe houses, seized shipments, and arrested associates. Yet somehow, Edgar managed to stay a step ahead. Many people still think that Edgar's increasingly violent tactics were excessive, even by cartel standards. Some argue that they ultimately drew too much attention, making him a target for both law enforcement and rivals. But others say they were necessary in an environment where hesitation could mean death. So what do you think? Was Edgar playing the only game available to him, or was he recklessly escalating a conflict that would eventually consume him? Despite the dangers, Edgar thrived. He lived in luxurious homes guarded by armed men, hosted extravagant parties where politicians rubbed shoulders with criminals, and traveled with a convoy of SUVs that signaled his importance. But he was also beginning to feel the pressure. Arturo Beltran Leyva's faction, though powerful, was not immune to the fractures forming within the Sinaloa cartel. Rumors of betrayal and shifting alliances filled the air like smoke. Edgar, ever observant, noticed the subtle changes in how people treated him. A joke that landed flat, a meeting he wasn't invited to. These were small but telling signs. Edgar's relationship with Arturo remained strong, at least on the surface, but he knew that trust in the cartel world was fragile. One misstep could undo everything he had built. He had seen it happen to others, men who had once been untouchable, suddenly finding themselves alone, hunted by both rivals and former allies. In the quiet moments, Edgar allowed himself to think about his family back in the United States. He missed them, but he also knew that his presence put them at risk. Cartel enemies wouldn't hesitate to use loved ones as leverage, and Edgar had made plenty of enemies. He sent money and gifts, trying to keep ties strong without drawing too much attention. But the distance weighed on him. As 2007 approached, Edgar found himself at a crossroads. He was more powerful than ever, but the foundations beneath his feet were beginning to shift. Arturo Beltran Leyva's growing conflict with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman threatened to split the Sinaloa cartel in two. Edgar would have to choose sides carefully, knowing that the wrong choice could cost him everything. One night, standing on the balcony of a villa in Cuernavaca, Edgar looked out at the glittering city lights and felt the weight of the decisions ahead. He had climbed higher than he ever imagined, but he knew that the fall from this height would be fatal. By early 2007, Edgar Valdez Villarreal was living in a reality that seemed almost surreal compared to his modest beginnings in Laredo. He had the cars, the mansions, the private security teams, and the kind of wealth that most people only dream about. Yet, beneath the veneer of luxury, there was tension, thick, suffocating tension that came from being caught in the middle of a cartel civil war that was slowly beginning to boil over. The rift between Arturo Beltran Leyva's faction and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's faction within the Sinaloa cartel was widening. Old alliances were fraying, and whispers of betrayal hung in the air like storm clouds. Edgar, fiercely loyal to Arturo, knew exactly where his loyalties lay, but he also understood the danger of being tied too closely to one side. El Chapo was no ordinary rival. He was one of the most powerful and cunning cartel leaders in history. To be on the wrong side of him was a gamble that could easily end in death. Arturo, however, trusted Edgar completely. He valued his protégé's ability to handle delicate matters with precision, whether that meant negotiating shipments with Colombian suppliers or dealing with uncooperative plaza bosses in Mexico. Edgar's reputation for violence was well earned by this point, but he also had a keen understanding of the importance of diplomacy. When Arturo needed someone to deliver a message, sometimes a warning, sometimes an offer, Edgar was often the man he sent. One mainstream historical fact from this time highlights how deadly the cartel world had become. By 2008, Mexico's drug war had claimed over 6,000 lives in a single year, a staggering number that captured international attention. President Calderon's military-led crackdown had disrupted many cartel operations, but it had also unleashed unprecedented violence as rival groups fought for control of key smuggling routes. Edgar and his faction were right in the middle of this storm. Edgar's operations continued to grow despite the chaos. He was moving massive quantities of cocaine and other drugs across the border into the United States, using a network of trusted couriers and hidden compartments in commercial vehicles. The profits were astronomical, but so was the pressure. Every shipment carried the risk of seizure. Every meeting carried the risk of betrayal. Edgar had learned to sleep lightly, always within reach of a weapon, always aware that a wrong decision could lead to his capture or death. Many people still think that Edgar's unwavering loyalty to Arturo was a fatal flaw, that he should have hedged his bets and cultivated a closer relationship with El Chapo's faction. But others argue that loyalty was one of Edgar's few constants in a world defined by treachery. So what do you think? Was Edgar a man bound by principle, or was he simply blinded by his allegiance to Arturo Beltran Leyva? As the conflict between the factions escalated, Edgar found himself involved in increasingly violent operations. Assassinations of rival operatives became routine, and Edgar's team often left a signature calling card, bodies left in public places, sometimes beheaded, as a grim warning to others. This was not merely cruelty. It was a calculated tactic designed to maintain control through fear. The Mexican public, however, was horrified, and the media began to report on Edgar's reputation as a man who cut heads in Mexico, cementing his terrifying image. Yet even as he navigated these brutal realities, Edgar retained an odd sense of charm. Those who met him in social settings often remarked on how personable and approachable he could be, cracking jokes and engaging in easy conversation. This duality, the ruthless enforcer and the charismatic host, made him all the more enigmatic. He could terrify one moment and disarm the next. Life at the top came with its perks, but it also meant constant vigilance. Edgar's security detail was extensive, often traveling in convoys of armored SUVs bristling with heavily armed men. He changed residences frequently, rarely sleeping in the same place 2 nights in a row. Safe houses dotted the map, some luxurious, others Spartan, all serving as temporary refuges from the storm swirling around him. One evening, while attending a gathering in Acapulco, Edgar received word of an ambush on one of his convoys. A shipment worth millions had been intercepted, and several of his men were dead. The attack had the fingerprints of El Chapo's allies all over it. Edgar's jaw tightened as he listened to the report. He knew this was more than just a business setback. It was a declaration of war. As he stood by the ocean later that night, the waves crashing against the shore, Edgar reflected on how far he had come and how precarious his position had become. He had wealth, power, and influence, but he was also a marked man in a conflict that was growing bloodier by the day. The decisions he would make in the coming months, how to retaliate, whom to trust, and where to place his bets, would determine whether he would continue to rise or whether the empire he had helped build would begin to crumble beneath him. The ambush on Edgar Valdez Villarreal's convoy was not just a loss of product and men. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a sign that El Chapo's allies were willing to test how far they could push Arturo Beltran Leyva's faction. Edgar knew there could be no hesitation in his response. In the world of cartels, hesitation was fatal. He immediately mobilized his lieutenants, calling for a series of retaliatory strikes designed to send a clear message. No one attacked Barbie and walked away unscathed. The next weeks became a blur of violence. Rival operatives were hunted down in border towns and safe houses, their bodies often left with deliberate brutality to amplify the message. Edgar understood the psychology of fear as much as the logistics of smuggling. If his enemies believed that striking at him would provoke an overwhelming response, they might think twice before trying again. But retaliation came at a cost. Law enforcement and military patrols intensified in areas where Edgar's faction operated, and news headlines screamed of escalating bloodshed. The Mexican public, already weary of drug war violence, began to associate La Barbie with some of its most gruesome episodes. Journalists documented scenes of decapitated bodies hung from bridges and notes pinned to corpses, warning rivals of their fate. It was a spectacle of terror that grabbed international attention. One mainstream historical fact illustrates how high the stakes had become. In 2008 alone, Mexican authorities seized over 25 tons of cocaine and tens of thousands of firearms linked to cartel operations. For Edgar, this meant his every move was now under a microscope, with both government forces and rivals waiting for him to slip. He could no longer count on moving shipments as freely as before. Many people still think that Edgar's decision to escalate violence rather than seek a quiet truce was the beginning of his undoing. Could he have brokered peace with El Chapo's allies, buying time to strengthen his position? Or was that even an option in a world where showing weakness could invite a death sentence? So what do you think? Did Edgar have a real choice, or was he boxed in by the brutal logic of the cartel war? Meanwhile, the strain on his operations was beginning to show. Couriers became harder to recruit, fearing the deadly crossfire. Some plaza bosses, local leaders who controlled specific territories, started wavering in their loyalty, wondering whether aligning with Arturo and Edgar was worth the risk. Edgar, who had built his reputation on decisiveness, began traveling more frequently to reinforce personal ties. He visited safe houses, sat with nervous lieutenants, and assured them that the faction remained strong. His charisma helped hold things together, but he could sense the cracks widening. In private, Edgar was more introspective than ever. He had grown accustomed to living with constant danger, but this felt different. The conflict with El Chapo's faction wasn't just about territory. It was about survival. Arturo, fiercely proud and unwilling to back down, was locked in a contest of wills with his former allies, and Edgar was caught in the middle. He respected Arturo deeply, but he also understood that the older man's pride could lead them all to disaster. At night, Edgar would sometimes retreat to a balcony or rooftop, staring out at the lights of cities like Cuernavaca or Acapulco. He thought about the family he rarely saw in the United States and wondered if they could even comprehend the life he was leading. He missed them, but he also knew that bringing them closer could put them in harm's way. His world was not one where you could simply step out for a family visit. One evening, while meeting with Arturo in a heavily guarded compound, Edgar raised the possibility of opening back-channel communications with El Chapo's faction. Arturo's response was swift and furious. "We don't negotiate with traitors," he snapped. The message was clear. There would be no peace. The civil war within the Sinaloa cartel would continue until one side was eliminated. As 2009 approached, Edgar felt the pressure building like a storm cloud overhead. He was wealthier than ever, but his life was becoming increasingly confined, defined by safe houses, armed convoys, and whispered conversations about who could be trusted. He began to notice more betrayal, more double-dealing among those he once considered allies. The paranoia that gripped Arturo started to creep into Edgar's own thoughts. Still, in public, Barbie maintained the same confident image that had carried him this far. He hosted parties, dressed impeccably, and spoke with the easy assurance of someone in control. But beneath the surface, he knew the walls were closing in. One night, after a particularly violent week, Edgar confided in a close lieutenant that he felt like they were living on borrowed time. The man nodded grimly. They all knew it was true. The question wasn't if the storm would break, but when, and whether they would survive it when it did. By the dawn of 2009, Edgar Valdez Villarreal had become a man defined by contradictions. On the one hand, he was immensely powerful, commanding a network that moved tons of narcotics into the United States and oversaw a vast fortune. On the other, he was cornered, hemmed in by rivals, hunted by law enforcement, and burdened by the growing instability within his own organization. He was a man who could buy anything he wanted, but could never enjoy it without glancing over his shoulder. Arturo Beltran. Leiva's feud with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada had escalated beyond repair. What had once been a unified Sinaloa cartel was now splintered, and Edgar, as one of Arturo's key lieutenants, was deeply entangled in the fallout. They had lost valuable territories in the north, particularly around Durango and Sinaloa, as El Chapo's forces tightened their grip. The Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, was fighting to hold on to its plazas, and Edgar was constantly on the move, trying to shore up support among increasingly nervous plaza bosses. Edgar's charismatic leadership style remained one of his greatest strengths. He visited commanders personally, reassuring them that the BLO was still strong. He reminded them of the rewards of loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. For many, this worked. But others, lured by the promise of safety or riches from El Chapo's camp, began quietly switching sides. One mainstream historical fact from this period paints a grim picture. In 2009, Mexico recorded over 9,600 drug war-related deaths, the highest annual toll up to that point. The country was effectively at war, and Edgar's operations were in the thick of it. Military checkpoints became a common sight on highways, helicopters patrolled urban skies, and special forces conducted raids on suspected cartel compounds. Every movement Edgar made had to be carefully calculated. His convoys rerouted to avoid ambushes or government traps. Despite the tightening noose, Edgar still managed to project an air of confidence. He hosted lavish parties in safe houses, complete with mariachi bands, fireworks, and expensive liquor. Photographs from this era, which would later surface after his capture, showed him smiling in tailored suits, often flanked by bodyguards with assault rifles slung over their shoulders. These images only fueled his legend, turning La Barbie into a symbol of both excess and impunity. But Edgar knew better than anyone how fragile that image was. Behind closed doors, he agonized over the growing sense that they were losing ground. Arturo's paranoia was worsening, and he trusted fewer and fewer people. Meetings were tense, filled with veiled accusations about informants and traitors. Edgar, who had always valued loyalty, found himself questioning everyone around him. Who could be trusted? Who was secretly working with El Chapo's faction or the government? Many people still think that Edgar's rising influence during this period put him on a collision course with Arturo himself. Some suggest that Arturo feared Edgar's charisma and organizational skills, viewing him as a potential rival. Others believe that Edgar remained unwaveringly loyal, focused only on protecting the BLO from external threats. So, what do you think? Was Edgar plotting his own power grab, or was he simply caught in the crossfire of his boss's growing paranoia? The pressures of the conflict also strained Edgar's personal life. He was rarely able to see his family in the United States, and when he did, it was brief and cloaked in secrecy. He tried to shield them from his world, but he knew they lived in a kind of quiet fear, aware that his enemies could use them as leverage. Edgar sent money, gifts, and reassurances, but nothing could erase the distance or the danger. At the same time, Edgar's operations were becoming more brutal. He ordered targeted assassinations not just of rivals, but of anyone suspected of aiding them. Bodies were left with messages scrawled on cardboard, a practice known as narcomantas, warning others not to defy him. These tactics worked in the short term, keeping his enemies at bay, but they also drew more scrutiny from the media and law enforcement. One night in Cuernavaca, Edgar received word that one of their top plazas in the state of Guerrero had fallen to El Chapo's forces. The loss was a major blow, cutting off a critical route for cocaine shipments. Arturo's rage was volcanic, and he demanded immediate retaliation. Edgar, ever the strategist, urged a more measured response, arguing that rushing into battle could cost them more lives and resources. But Arturo wasn't listening. The dynamic between the two men was changing. Edgar, who had once enjoyed a close bond with Arturo, now found himself increasingly at odds with his mentor. He could sense that Arturo's trust in him was wavering, and that mistrust in the cartel world was often a death sentence. As Edgar lay awake that night, the muffled sounds of his security team moving through the house outside his bedroom, he wondered if the real threat was no longer El Chapo's faction, but the man he had pledged his loyalty to. It was a sobering thought, one that would stay with him in the turbulent months ahead. The tension between Edgar Valdez Villarreal and Arturo Beltran Leyva was becoming impossible to ignore. For years, Edgar had been Arturo's trusted lieutenant, the man he could rely on to execute plans with precision and handle problems with unflinching decisiveness. But now, in the charged atmosphere of 2009, their relationship was strained by paranoia, losses, and the constant threat of betrayal. Arturo was becoming increasingly isolated, convinced that informants had infiltrated their ranks. He shuffled personnel, ordered lieutenants to spy on each other, and grew suspicious of anyone who questioned his decisions. Edgar, who valued loyalty above all else, struggled with the toxic atmosphere. He had built his own network of loyal operatives and plaza bosses, but he could see how fear was corroding morale. His men were nervous, hesitant, and more likely to second-guess orders. A dangerous development in a world where hesitation could get you killed. Meanwhile, the Mexican government was tightening the screws. The military had expanded its presence in cartel strongholds, conducting raids that dismantled safe houses and confiscated shipments. Edgar had always prided himself on staying one step ahead of authorities, but the increased surveillance made even simple operations more complicated. He had to change safe houses constantly, relying on a shrinking circle of trusted aides to keep him informed. One mainstream historical fact highlights the mounting pressure. In December 2009, Mexican Marines killed Arturo Beltran Leyva in a dramatic raid in Cuernavaca. This was a major blow to the BLO, sending shockwaves through the cartel world. But before Arturo's death, in the tense weeks leading up to that raid, Edgar could sense that something catastrophic was on the horizon. The government had clearly made Arturo a top priority, and the noose was tightening. Many people still think that Edgar's growing influence in Arturo's organization made him a target of suspicion. Was Arturo beginning to see him as a potential usurper? Some say yes, arguing that Arturo feared Edgar's charisma and organizational skills. Others believe Edgar remained steadfastly loyal, focused only on defending the organization. So what do you think? Did Arturo's paranoia extend to Barbie, or was their bond unshakable until the very end? As Arturo's paranoia deepened, he began to question Edgar's advice more frequently. When Edgar suggested relocating certain operations to avoid detection, Arturo overruled him. When Edgar cautioned against retaliatory strikes that would only draw more government attention, Arturo ignored the warnings. Edgar found himself in a dangerous position, too influential to be ignored, but not influential enough to change the course Arturo was determined to follow. Edgar's inner circle urged him to consider his options. Some whispered that he should break away, form his own organization, and protect himself from the chaos surrounding Arturo. But Edgar was torn. He owed much of his rise to Arturo and believed in the code of loyalty that had guided him since his earliest days. Yet he also knew that staying too close to Arturo could prove fatal. In the final weeks of 2009, the BLO was under siege. Government forces were raiding properties daily, seizing cash, weapons, and drugs. Edgar's operations were disrupted constantly, and shipments that once moved smoothly were now being intercepted at alarming rates. He was exhausted, rarely sleeping more than a few hours at a time and constantly traveling between safe houses. Then came the news that would change everything. Arturo Beltran Leyva had been killed during a military operation. The raid was swift and merciless, leaving no doubt that the Mexican government was determined to dismantle the BLO. Edgar, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Arturo at the height of their power, was now left to pick up the pieces of a shattered organization. The days following Arturo's death were chaotic. Rival factions moved quickly to fill the power vacuum, and Edgar found himself thrust into a leadership role, whether he wanted it or not. He still had loyal lieutenants and significant resources, but he also had enemies circling like vultures, eager to capitalize on the BLO's weakness. As Edgar sat in a safe house outside Mexico City, surrounded by armed guards and staring at the flickering glow of a television broadcasting images of Arturo's bloodied body, he knew that the next chapter of his life would be even more dangerous. He was no longer the trusted lieutenant. He was now the man at the center of a storm. The death of Arturo Beltran Leyva in December 2009 marked a turning point for Edgar Valdez Villarreal. It was not just the loss of a mentor. It was the collapse of the organizational structure that had protected and empowered him. With Arturo gone, the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, was thrown into chaos. Rival factions immediately began vying for control, and Edgar, known for his ambition and charisma, was suddenly at the center of this power struggle. The days after Arturo's death were a blur of emergency meetings and tense conversations. Edgar's phone buzzed constantly with calls from plaza bosses, lieutenants, and allies desperate for guidance. He moved from one safe house to another, accompanied by convoys of armored SUVs bristling with gunmen. The mood among his men was grim. Without Arturo's unifying presence, the BLO's future was uncertain. Edgar knew he had to act quickly. He reached out to Arturo's remaining loyalists, working to consolidate the organization's resources and reassure them that they could weather the storm. He promised stability, wealth, and protection, but he was also realistic. The BLO's enemies, particularly Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, were not going to wait. They would move swiftly to exploit the BLO's vulnerability, seizing territories and recruiting disillusioned operatives. One mainstream historical fact underscores how precarious Edgar's position had become. After Arturo's death, the Mexican government publicly declared the BLO to be in disarray, and authorities intensified efforts to dismantle what remained of the organization. Military checkpoints and raids became even more frequent, and Edgar was now a prime target. His face appeared on wanted posters and in news reports, often accompanied by sensational descriptions of his alleged brutality. Many people still think that Edgar's decision to step into a leadership role was inevitable, but others argue he should have cut his losses and disappeared. Could he have fled, taking his wealth and starting a new life far from Mexico? Or was he too deeply entangled, too marked a man to ever truly escape? So what do you think? Did Edgar have any real choice but to stay and fight? Edgar's first challenge as a de facto leader was to secure his remaining territories. He met with plaza bosses in places like Guerrero, Morelos, and the state of Mexico, urging them to remain loyal. Some responded positively, grateful for his efforts to stabilize the organization. Others were hesitant, quietly entertaining offers from rival groups. Edgar knew that any sign of weakness could spark defections, so he made it clear that betrayal would be met with swift retribution. At the same time, Edgar sought to maintain the BLO's alliances with Colombian suppliers. These relationships were vital, Without a steady flow of product, the organization's financial base would crumble. Edgar's charisma and reputation helped him reassure the Colombians, but he could sense their doubts. They had other options, other buyers who weren't embroiled in a cartel civil war. As he navigated these challenges, Edgar also had to contend with growing paranoia within his own ranks. Arturo's death had left everyone on edge, and accusations of betrayal flew freely. Edgar himself was not immune to suspicion. Some whispered that he had secretly conspired with the government or even with El Chapo to eliminate Arturo and take control. These rumors infuriated Edgar, who had been fiercely loyal to Arturo until the end, but he understood that perception was as dangerous as reality in the cartel world. Despite the turmoil, Edgar managed to project an image of control. He continued to host gatherings for his inner circle, providing food, drink, and reassurances that the BLO could survive. But behind closed doors, he was acutely aware of the growing list of threats. Rival factions wanted him dead, the government wanted him captured, and some within his own organization, desperate to save themselves, might decide that turning on Barbie was their best option. One night, while staying at a fortified compound outside Cuernavaca, Edgar sat alone in a dimly lit room, reviewing intelligence reports from his network of informants. The news was grim. El Chapo's forces were pushing deeper into BLO territory, and several mid-level commanders had already defected. Edgar clenched his jaw as he considered his next move. He knew he couldn't match El Chapo's resources head-on, but he could outthink him. He began devising a strategy to shore up his defenses while striking back at key targets. Yet even as he plotted his next steps, Edgar couldn't escape the nagging feeling that time was running out. He had inherited Arturo's enemies and his responsibilities, but without Arturo's iron grip, the organization was fracturing. Every day brought new rumors of betrayal, new reports of losses, and every night Edgar went to bed knowing that his enemies, and possibly some of his friends, were searching for a way to end his reign. The weight of leadership was heavy, but Edgar had no intention of surrendering. He had fought too hard, climbed too far, to simply fade away. If the world wanted to come for Barbie, he would be ready. The mantle of leadership weighed heavily on Edgar Valdez Villarreal as 2010 unfolded. He had stepped into a role that was as dangerous as it was powerful. Without Arturo Beltran Leiva's unifying presence, the BLO was a fractured shell of its former self, and Edgar was the face everyone looked to for direction. He knew that every move he made was being scrutinized by both allies and enemies, and one wrong decision could cost him everything. The first order of business was survival. Edgar doubled down on security, reinforcing his inner circle with men he trusted implicitly. These were operatives he had personally groomed over the years, men who owed their careers, and often their lives, to him. He surrounded himself with layers of protection, armored SUVs, safe houses fortified like bunkers, and heavily armed guards who moved with the precision of a private military unit. The days of casually attending parties or showing off in public were over. Now every step outside a secure compound carried the risk of ambush. Yet, even in this defensive posture, Edgar had to project strength. He knew that any sign of weakness would accelerate defections and embolden rivals. He traveled constantly, visiting plazas across Mexico to reassure nervous commanders. In Guerrero, he promised reinforcements. In Morelos, he delivered cash bonuses to those who had stayed loyal. His presence was magnetic. He could calm a room simply by walking into it, but he also carried an unspoken warning. Betrayal would not be tolerated. One mainstream historical fact illustrates the environment Edgar was operating in. By mid-2010, the Mexican government's war on drugs had resulted in over 28,000 deaths since President Felipe Calderón launched the offensive in 2006. The country was engulfed in unprecedented violence, and cartels like the BLO were under constant assault from both rivals and the state. Edgar's face was plastered on wanted posters and splashed across television screens, described as one of Mexico's most dangerous and elusive fugitives. Many people still think that Edgar's decision to remain active, visiting territories and managing operations personally, was reckless. Should he have stepped back, gone underground, and focused solely on self-preservation? Or was his hands-on approach the only way to keep the BLO from collapsing entirely? So what do you think? Was Barbie a bold leader, or a man unwilling to let go of the illusion of control? While Edgar struggled to maintain cohesion, rival factions were circling like sharks. Joaquin El Chapo, Guzman's Sinaloa cartel, had seized key territories once controlled by the BLO, and the powerful Zetas cartel was expanding aggressively as well. Both organizations saw Edgar's weakened position as an opportunity. Skirmishes broke out frequently, and Edgar's lieutenants were often forced to fight pitched battles just to hold on to critical smuggling routes. Inside the BLO, paranoia was spreading. The loss of Arturo had left a vacuum of trust, and whispers of betrayal became a constant undercurrent. Edgar knew that the government had infiltrators within their ranks. It was only a matter of time before someone close to him tried to trade information for leniency. He ordered regular vetting of his inner circle, but he understood that no amount of caution could eliminate the threat entirely. Despite the dangers, Edgar maintained a public image of defiance. He continued to host gatherings at his compounds, bringing in musicians and chefs to entertain his men. He handed out gifts to local communities, reinforcing his image as a benefactor. To the outside world, Barbie was still larger than life, a man untouchable, even as the walls closed in. But behind closed doors, Edgar was wrestling with doubts. He missed the relative stability of the days when Arturo had been alive, when the BLO was a cohesive force, capable of challenging any rival. Now, he was fighting a war on multiple fronts, with fewer resources and fewer allies. He began to consider options he would never have entertained before. Could he broker a deal with the government? Could he align himself with a rival cartel, trading autonomy for survival? These thoughts were dangerous, even in private. Edgar knew that any hint of negotiation with the authorities or enemies could spark rebellion among his men. But he was pragmatic. He understood that the BLO in its current form could not endure indefinitely. One night, as he sat alone in a safe house outside Mexico City, Edgar allowed himself a moment of introspection. He thought about his family in the United States, about the football fields of Laredo, where he had once dreamed of a different life. He wondered how it had all come to this, how ambition had led him to become a fugitive, hunted by governments and rivals alike. The sound of gunfire in the distance jolted him back to reality. It was a reminder that reflection was a luxury he could ill afford. The next day, Edgar resumed his relentless schedule, determined to hold the BLO together for as long as he could. But deep down, he knew that the clock was ticking, and each day that passed brought him closer to an inevitable confrontation with his enemies, or with fate itself. By mid-2010, Edgar Valdez Villarreal's situation was becoming untenable. He had managed to keep the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, afloat after Arturo's death, but it was a fragile patchwork operation held together by Edgar's charisma and sheer force of will. Every week brought new reports of territory lost, shipments seized, or commanders defecting to rival cartels. The sense of inevitability, that the BLO's collapse was only a matter of time, hung over Edgar like a storm cloud. Edgar's focus narrowed to survival and stability. He moved constantly between fortified safe houses, never staying in one place long enough for enemies or law enforcement to pinpoint his location. He relied on a network of loyal lieutenants to maintain contact with his remaining plazas. But even within his inner circle, paranoia was mounting. One whisper of betrayal could spark deadly purges, and Edgar had to balance suspicion with trust, knowing that alienating the wrong person could trigger a mutiny. The Mexican government intensified its efforts to capture him, spurred on by growing public pressure and the desire to strike another symbolic blow in the war on drugs. His face was splashed across national television, and the bounty on his head increased. Soldiers conducted raids in Guerrero, Morelos, and the state of Mexico, often based on tips from informants. Edgar knew these raids weren't random. Someone in his orbit was feeding information to the authorities. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the climate of 2010. Mexico had surpassed 30,000 drug war-related deaths since 2006, and President Calderon's administration faced mounting criticism for the spiraling violence. For government forces, capturing or killing figures like Barbie was as much about public relations as law enforcement. Edgar understood that he had become a high-value trophy, and this knowledge only deepened his mistrust of those around him. Many people still think that Edgar should have gone completely underground at this point, severing ties and disappearing into the wilderness. Others argue that his decision to keep managing the BLO personally was a sign of hubris, an unwillingness to relinquish control, even as the organization disintegrated. So, what do you think? Was Edgar clinging to power, or was he simply trying to protect the men who still believed in him? Edgar's response to the pressure was to double down on loyalty. He met with his closest lieutenants in secluded ranches, reinforcing their bonds with both rewards and veiled warnings. He promised higher payouts and greater autonomy, but made it clear that betrayal would be punished with extreme prejudice. These meetings often had the atmosphere of family gatherings, with Edgar sharing meals and stories, laughing easily, and reminding everyone why they had chosen to follow him. Yet beneath the camaraderie, there was always an edge of fear. As his options dwindled, Edgar also explored the possibility of forming alliances with other cartels. He reached out quietly to intermediaries connected to groups like Los Zetas, and even considered overtures from factions loyal to El Chapo Guzman. These talks were tentative and fraught with risk. Any hint of disloyalty could shatter what remained of the BLO. Still, Edgar was pragmatic enough to know that going it alone might no longer be feasible. Meanwhile, his public image continued to evolve. The Mexican media portrayed Barbie as both a dangerous fugitive and a flamboyant symbol of cartel excess. Photographs from earlier years, Edgar smiling in tailored suits, posing at lavish parties, were broadcast alongside images of crime scenes attributed to his organization. To the public, he was a figure of both fascination and fear. In quieter moments, Edgar wrestled with the personal toll of his life on the run. He missed his family in the United States and worried constantly about their safety. He knew they were potential targets for his enemies, and he tried to protect them from afar, sending money discreetly and avoiding contact that could draw unwanted attention. But the distance weighed heavily on him, and he wondered if they would ever understand the choices he had made. One night, After a long day of traveling between safe houses, Edgar sat alone in a dimly lit room, staring at a map spread out on a table. He traced his finger along the routes he had once controlled with ease, now dotted with rival checkpoints and government strongholds. He felt the walls closing in. He still had men, weapons, and resources, but his empire was shrinking, and he could feel the clock ticking louder with each passing day. Edgar knew that a decisive moment was coming. Either he would find a way to stabilize the BLO and reassert control, or he would be captured or killed, like so many cartel leaders before him. And as he extinguished the last cigarette in a tray overflowing with ashes, he resolved that if the end came, it would not come quietly. By late summer of 2010, Edgar Valdez Villarreal could feel the tightening grip of inevitability. Each day brought new reports that confirmed what he already knew in his gut. The Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, was unraveling. Territories that once reliably funneled cash and product were now slipping through his fingers. Plaza bosses defected, either lured by the promises of rivals or seeking safety from government forces. Even the Colombian suppliers were beginning to waver, sending fewer shipments and demanding stricter terms. Edgar understood that he was losing leverage, but he was not ready to accept defeat. He tried to adapt. Edgar shifted from large-scale operations to smaller, more agile smuggling efforts, hoping to avoid the sweeping seizures that were gutting his profits. He relied increasingly on safe houses scattered throughout central Mexico, moving constantly to stay ahead of both law enforcement and rivals. The paranoia that had once belonged primarily to Arturo Beltran Leyva now consumed Edgar as well. He vetted every visitor, double-checked every piece of intelligence, and rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. Yet, even in this defensive posture, Edgar projected an image of confidence. He knew that fear could destroy what little cohesion remained in the BLO. So, he continued to appear in plazas where his presence was needed most, arriving in convoys of armored SUVs, greeting his men with handshakes and jokes, and reinforcing the idea that Barbie was still firmly in control. To many of his followers, these visits were a source of reassurance. But Edgar could see the doubts in their eyes, the quiet questions about whether loyalty to him was worth the risk. One mainstream historical fact from this period underscores the danger he was in. By 2010, Mexico's Attorney General's office had launched a specialized task force dedicated solely to capturing high-profile cartel figures. Edgar's name was at the top of that list. The government was determined to claim him as a prize, a tangible symbol of progress in a drug war that had cost over 30,000 lives since 2006. Soldiers and federal police were given his photograph, and tip lines buzzed with calls from informants hoping to collect the multi-million peso bounty on his head. Many people still think that Edgar's decision to remain visible was reckless. Wouldn't it have been smarter to disappear completely, to retreat into the shadows and wait for the pressure to ease? Or was staying in front of his men the only way to prevent the BLO from collapsing entirely? So what do you think? Was Barbie courageous, or simply unwilling to accept the reality of his situation? Inside the BLO, fractures were widening. Some lieutenants began to quietly negotiate with rival cartels, hoping to secure their survival should Edgar fall. Others considered surrendering to authorities, calculating that prison might be safer than the battlefield the streets had become. Edgar could sense this growing disloyalty, and it weighed heavily on him. He had built his career on loyalty, on the belief that his men would stand by him as he had stood by Arturo. But loyalty, he was learning, was often a luxury in the cartel world, one that disappeared when survival was at stake. Edgar responded with a mix of incentives and fear. He offered higher payouts to those who stayed, handing out stacks of cash like lifelines. At the same time, he made it clear that betrayal would be met with ruthless consequences. Several suspected traitors were captured and executed, their bodies left with messages warning others not to follow their example. These acts bought Edgar time, but they also deepened the atmosphere of dread within his ranks. His enemies sensed his vulnerability. The Sinaloa cartel, now firmly under El Chapo Guzman's control, pushed aggressively into former BLO territories, while the Zetas expanded from the east. Edgar was effectively surrounded, fighting a two-front war while dodging relentless government pressure. He tried to broker temporary alliances, but rivals saw little reason to compromise. They believed that Barbie's days were numbered, and that the BLO would soon be a memory. In the rare moments he was alone, Edgar allowed himself to think about the possibility of capture. He knew that the government wanted him alive, to parade him in front of cameras as a sign of victory. But capture could also mean extradition to the United States, where the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence loomed. He had heard rumors that other cartel figures had attempted to negotiate leniency by offering information, but he had always scoffed at the idea. Now he wasn't so sure. As August drew to a close, Edgar's movements became increasingly cautious. He avoided public places, relying instead on remote safe houses in the state of Mexico. His network of informants fed him a steady stream of intelligence about raids and military operations, allowing him to narrowly avoid several close calls. But he knew that his luck could not hold forever. One night, after reviewing a list of recent betrayals, Edgar confided to a trusted aide, "We're not fighting to win anymore. We're just fighting to make it to tomorrow." It was a rare admission of vulnerability, one that revealed how deeply he understood the precariousness of his position. By September of 2010, Edgar Valdez Villarreal was living in a world where every sound, every shadow, felt like a threat. The Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, was a fraction of its former self, and Edgar, once the confident lieutenant who could balance charm with ferocity, was now the embattled leader of a collapsing empire. His days were consumed by constant movement, safe house to safe house, town to town, rarely staying anywhere long enough for the enemy or the government to catch up. Edgar's resources were dwindling. Fewer lieutenants remained loyal, and those who did often lacked the manpower and weaponry to hold their territories. Cartel rivals like the Sinaloa cartel and Los Zetas were pressing harder than ever, encroaching on smuggling routes and poaching operatives. At the same time, the Mexican government was intensifying its search for Barbie. Federal police, soldiers, and special forces units were fed intelligence from informants, many of whom were motivated by the enormous bounty on Edgar's head. The stress of constant flight was taking a toll. Edgar barely slept, relying on energy drinks and short naps to keep himself sharp. He ate meals quickly and often in the back seat of a moving SUV, his security team scanning the horizon for checkpoints or ambushes. Yet even in this precarious state, Edgar clung to routines that projected confidence. He still insisted on visiting the few remaining BLO plazas personally, rallying the men with his presence. It was a dangerous choice, but he believed that disappearing entirely would only hasten the organization's collapse. One mainstream historical fact underlines the intensity of the hunt for Edgar. By this time, the Mexican government was working closely with U.S. agencies, including the DEA, to coordinate intelligence operations. Wiretaps, satellite tracking, and informant networks were all being deployed with one goal: to bring Barbie into custody. Edgar's name was now at the very top of Mexico's most wanted list. Many people still think that Edgar should have used this period to disappear completely, perhaps fleeing to another country with the money he had left. Others argue that by this point, the walls were already too close. There was nowhere left for him to run. So what do you think? Could Barbie have slipped away into anonymity, or was he already too famous, too marked to vanish? Inside the BLO, Edgar's leadership was being tested at every turn. Rumors of betrayal circulated constantly, and he knew that someone close could be feeding information to the government. He tightened security measures, reduced the number of people who knew his movements, and even rotated his bodyguards frequently to prevent infiltration. But he understood that no system was foolproof. Despite the paranoia, Edgar remained calculating. He reached out quietly to intermediaries connected to rival cartels, exploring the possibility of alliances. If the BLO was to survive, he needed external support. But rivals saw little value in propping up a crumbling organization. Negotiations went nowhere, leaving Edgar increasingly isolated. In his rare moments alone, Edgar reflected on the life that had brought him here. He thought about his family in the United States, the football fields of Laredo, and the choices that had seemed so small at the time, but had led him to become one of the most hunted men in Mexico. These thoughts didn't make him sentimental. He had learned long ago to suppress such feelings, but they did remind him of the stakes. Capture wasn't just about prison. It meant losing everything he had fought to build. One evening, while staying at a remote safe house in the state of Mexico, Edgar received word that government forces were conducting raids in nearby towns. His security team urged him to leave immediately, but Edgar hesitated. Moving too quickly could draw attention, and every movement carried risk. He finally agreed, slipping out under the cover of darkness, his convoy navigating rural roads to avoid checkpoints. This constant cat-and-mouse existence had become his reality. Each day was a test of endurance and instinct. Edgar knew that his luck was running out. He had escaped capture so many times that it felt almost inevitable that one day, the odds would turn against him. Still, he refused to surrender. As he told one of his lieutenants during a tense car ride, "If they want Barbie, they'll have to come and take me." But even as he said the words, Edgar understood that the government was closing in. The net was tightening, and he was running out of places to hide. Edgar Valdez Villarreal's instincts had rarely failed him, but as September 2010 moved into its second week, he could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down. The network of safe houses and loyal operatives he had relied on for years was shrinking to a threadbare shadow. Each new message carried more bad news: a raid on one of their compounds, a plaza boss defecting to the Sinaloa cartel, a shipment seized at a highway checkpoint. Edgar was fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win forever, but he wasn't ready to go quietly. On the morning of September 12th, Edgar and a handful of trusted men left a small compound in the state of Mexico, moving toward another safe house near Lerma. The convoy was stripped down to avoid detection. Just 2 SUVs, unremarkable to anyone glancing at them from the roadside. Edgar wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, a simple jacket, and kept a pistol close at hand. The men who traveled with him were seasoned veterans, each one fully aware that this trip could be their last. By now, Edgar understood that the government's intelligence network was too sophisticated to evade forever. U.S. agencies were feeding information to Mexican forces, and tip lines hummed with rumors of his movements. He rotated vehicles constantly, changed routes at the last minute, and even switched drivers mid-journey to throw off pursuers. But there were only so many precautions a man could take. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the government's determination: by 2010, joint U.S.-Mexico operations had successfully captured or killed more than 21 high-ranking cartel leaders. Edgar knew the numbers. He was one of the last remaining figures on that list, and the pressure to bring him in was enormous. The Mexican government wanted a trophy, and Barbie was the perfect target. Many people still think Edgar should have fled Mexico entirely at this point, perhaps heading south into Central America, where he might have had a better chance of disappearing. Others believe it was already too late. His notoriety made him too recognizable to hide. So what do you think? Could Edgar have slipped away, or was his fate sealed long before that September morning? As Edgar's convoy approached the outskirts of Lerma, he noticed subtle changes that put him on edge. A car idled too long at an intersection. A man on a motorcycle slowed as they passed, speaking quickly into a cell phone. Edgar's instincts screamed at him that they had been spotted. He told his driver to alter the route, cutting through side streets and rural roads, but he could feel the invisible net closing in. They reached the safe house without incident, but Edgar's unease only grew. He ordered his men to check the perimeter, scanning for any signs of surveillance. For hours, the compound remained quiet. Edgar sat at a table inside, sipping coffee and reviewing reports from his dwindling network. He knew his options were nearly exhausted. He could keep running, hoping for one more close escape, or he could try to negotiate his way out. But who could he trust to broker such a deal? And would they even honor it? That evening, as Edgar stepped out into the courtyard to stretch his legs, one of his lieutenants approached him. "We're hearing chatter," the man said quietly. "They know we're here." Edgar nodded, already anticipating the words. He looked around at the armed guards posted near the gates, at the men who had followed him through years of war and bloodshed. He knew that if the government came, the fight would be swift and one-sided. "Stay sharp," he told them, his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. "We don't get second chances." Inside the safe house, Edgar loaded his pistol and placed extra magazines within reach. He had lived his entire adult life in a world of violence, and he had no illusions about how this could end. But even as he prepared for the worst, a small part of him still believed he might escape. He thought of his family in the United States, of the life he had once imagined for himself before the cartels claimed him. That thought, fleeting and fragile, was enough to steel his resolve. And then, the night erupted. The compound's gates shuddered as armed units surrounded the property. Floodlights lit up the walls, and the voices of federal police barked commands over loudspeakers. Edgar's men scrambled into defensive positions, weapons at the ready, but Edgar raised a hand to stop them. He could see the futility of resistance. The government had come with overwhelming force, and any attempt to fight would only lead to a bloodbath. "Stand down," Edgar said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man who understood that the game was over. As the gates burst open and heavily armed officers flooded the courtyard, Edgar stepped forward with his hands raised, his face impassive. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Cameras clicked as they closed in, capturing the image of Barbie's arrest that would be broadcast around the world. The hunt for Edgar Valdez Villarreal was finally over. The arrest of Edgar Valdez Villarreal on September 12, 2010, was as dramatic as the Mexican government could have hoped. Within hours, the news broke across national television networks, showing images of Barbie flanked by heavily armed federal police, his blonde hair disheveled, but his expression oddly calm, even smug. To the authorities, he was a prize catch, a living symbol that the government's war on drugs was producing results. For Edgar, it was the beginning of a new reality, one defined not by power and mobility, but by cold cells and relentless interrogation. He was transported under heavy guard to Mexico City, a convoy of armored vehicles cutting through the night as helicopters hovered above. Inside one of the lead vehicles, Edgar sat shackled and silent, his mind racing. He understood what this capture meant, not just for him, but for the remnants of the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO. Without his leadership, what little cohesion the BLO had left would crumble. Rivals would swoop in to take control of territories, and men who had once sworn loyalty would scatter to the wind. One mainstream historical fact underscores the significance of his arrest. Barbie was the first major cartel leader captured alive since the government had intensified its crackdown in 2006. Dozens had been killed in shootouts, but Edgar's capture allowed authorities to parade him before the media, his very presence reinforcing their narrative of progress. It was a public relations victory in a war that had claimed tens of thousands of lives. Many people still think Edgar's demeanor at the press conference that followed was telling. Standing before flashing cameras, flanked by masked federal police, he appeared almost unfazed, even cracking a small smile at one point. Was this bravado, a calculated display of defiance? Or was it simply Edgar being Edgar, a man who had long ago mastered the art of projecting control? So what do you think? Was Barbie's calmness a facade, or was he genuinely unshaken by the fall of his empire? Behind closed doors, however, Edgar faced a different reality. Interrogations began almost immediately. Mexican authorities wanted details about his operations, his associates, and the connections between the BLO and rival cartels. Edgar, who had spent years navigating the treacherous politics of the underworld, understood the stakes. Every word he spoke could mean life or death for himself or others. He played his interrogators carefully, giving them just enough to keep them talking without betraying those who might retaliate against him. But Edgar was also pragmatic. He knew that cooperation could be a bargaining chip. Rumors swirled among officials that he was offering to provide information in exchange for leniency or protection from his enemies. These rumors, whether true or not, fed speculation that Barbie might one day become a witness against other cartel leaders. In his cell, Edgar had time to reflect on the choices that had led him here. He thought about Arturo Beltran Leyva, about the days when the BLO had seemed unstoppable, about the mansions and the parties and the fleets of armored SUVs. He thought about his family in the United States, people he hadn't seen in years, and wondered if they had seen the images of him in custody. Did they feel relief? Shame? Fear? Life in detention was starkly different from the world Edgar had once known. There were no lavish meals, no loyal soldiers at his side. He slept on a thin mattress, ate bland prison food, and spent hours in small, windowless rooms with federal agents. Yet even in this environment, Edgar retained a sense of composure. He had learned long ago that survival depended on adapting to circumstances, no matter how grim. Meanwhile, the BLO was collapsing without him. Territories were absorbed by rival cartels, and those who had once been part of his inner circle were either captured, killed, or defected to competitors. Edgar's name still carried weight, but he no longer had the means to wield it. The empire he had fought to hold together for so long was dissolving before his eyes. As weeks turned into months, Edgar faced the growing likelihood of extradition to the United States. The U.S. government had long sought to prosecute him for trafficking massive quantities of cocaine into the country, and Mexican officials hinted that his transfer north was inevitable. Edgar understood what that meant: a high-profile trial, a lengthy prison sentence, and the possibility that his past would be dissected in open court. Yet even with the walls closing in, Edgar refused to show fear. One night, as he spoke quietly with a fellow detainee, he was asked how he managed to stay so calm. He shrugged and replied, "I've always known how this ends. The only question is how you carry yourself when it comes." As Edgar Valdez Villarreal settled into his new reality behind bars, the walls of his world closed in further. Every day was a routine of interrogations, security checks, and brief moments of solitude in a stark cell. The Mexican authorities viewed Barbie not just as a prisoner, but as a high-value asset. They wanted information: names, routes, safe houses, and insight into the shifting landscape of the cartel underworld. Edgar, however, understood that the information he held was currency, and he would not spend it carelessly. By now, he knew the extradition process to the United States was inevitable. U.S. authorities had long sought him for trafficking vast quantities of cocaine into cities like Atlanta and Dallas, and with his capture, they had their chance. Edgar's attorneys informed him that American prosecutors were preparing an airtight case, leveraging years of evidence and witness testimony. There would be no quick way out, no chance of slipping through legal loopholes. The best he could hope for was a deal, but Edgar wasn't ready to fold. He had built a career on staying one step ahead, and prison was no different. He used the small privileges afforded to him, phone calls, limited visits, to maintain what little influence he could. He reached out discreetly to old contacts, gauging whether alliances could be rekindled or favors called in. Yet, with his empire in ruins, those contacts had little reason to stick their necks out for him. Many had already switched sides, joined rivals, or been eliminated. One mainstream historical fact reflects the magnitude of Edgar's downfall. By the time of his capture, authorities had seized hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets tied to his network, from mansions in Acapulco to fleets of luxury vehicles. Edgar, who had once flaunted wealth as a symbol of power, now had nothing. Even his ability to bribe officials, a lifeline for many cartel figures, was gone. Many people still think that Edgar's capture was the result of betrayal from within his circle. Some believe that a close lieutenant sold him out in exchange for leniency or a payout. Others argue that it was simply the culmination of relentless intelligence work by Mexican and U.S. forces. So what do you think? Was Barbie betrayed by someone he trusted, or was he simply outmatched by the sheer resources of two governments? While awaiting extradition, Edgar kept a close watch on the news. He saw reports of the continued bloodshed in Mexico, of the power struggles that erupted after the dismantling of the BLO. Rivals like the Sinaloa cartel and Los Zetas had absorbed many of the territories once under his control, fueling even greater violence as they clashed with each other. Edgar, who had once been a central figure in these conflicts, was now a spectator. In his rare moments of reflection, he considered how quickly everything had unraveled. He remembered the days of confidence and control, when his name carried both fear and respect. He thought about Arturo Beltran Leyva, about the loyalty that had defined their relationship, and wondered if things might have turned out differently had Arturo survived. He thought about his family in the United States, people he could no longer protect or even contact freely. Life inside the detention facility had a rhythm, but it was not one Edgar could ever get used to. The constant surveillance, the absence of trust, the knowledge that everyone around him, guards, inmates, even lawyers, had their own agendas. It was a world where vulnerability was dangerous. Yet Edgar was no longer in a position to project the invincibility that had defined him for so long. He began to write letters. Some were to his family, carefully worded to avoid revealing too much. Others were addressed to no one in particular, reflections on the choices he had made and the consequences that had followed. These letters were never sent, but Edgar kept them hidden in his cell, a private outlet in a life stripped of freedom. As the months passed, the talk of extradition became more concrete. U.S. Marshals would eventually arrive to take custody of him, and once he was on American soil, the legal process would move swiftly. Edgar prepared himself mentally for this next chapter. He knew the conditions would be even harsher in the United States, the sentences even longer. But he also knew that survival depended on adapting, and Edgar Valdez Villarreal had always been a survivor. One night, as he lay awake in his narrow cot, Edgar listened to the distant hum of generators and the occasional shout from another inmate. He thought about the life he had once led, the luxuries and the violence, the loyalty and the betrayals. And he wondered if he had ever truly been in control, or if he had simply been riding a wave that was destined to crash. He closed his eyes, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Whatever came next, he would face it the same way he had faced everything else, head on, without flinching. Edgar Valdez Villarreal's extradition to the United States was not a question of if, but when. As 2011 dawned, the formal process was already in motion. The U.S. Justice Department had built its case for years, tying Edgar to enormous quantities of cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana funneled through his sophisticated smuggling routes. Agents in Atlanta, Dallas, and Laredo were eager to finally bring Barbie before an American judge. In Mexico, Edgar remained under heavy guard in a high-security federal facility. His days were rigidly structured. Wake up, eat, brief outdoor time, interrogations, then the quiet monotony of his cell. He knew he was a trophy prisoner, one of the most notorious cartel leaders ever captured alive, and the authorities made sure he understood his diminished status. He was often moved without notice, stripped of personal items, and subjected to sudden inspections. These measures weren't just about security, they were psychological tactics, a way to keep him off balance. But Edgar refused to let them see weakness. He carried himself with the same cool demeanor he had displayed during the press conference after his arrest. He joked with guards when the opportunity arose, kept his posture straight, and maintained a routine that gave structure to the otherwise shapeless days. He exercised in his cell, wrote letters, and replayed memories of his past, moments of power, family, and fleeting peace. Like a film he could no longer pause. One mainstream historical fact highlights the scale of the U.S. case. Prosecutors allege that Edgar had overseen the distribution of over 1 ton of cocaine per month into American cities at the height of his operations. These quantities were staggering, and they painted a picture of a man who had been more than just a player in the drug trade. He had been an architect of its infrastructure. Many people still think that Edgar might have tried to negotiate a deal before his extradition, perhaps offering intelligence in exchange for leniency. Some former agents suggest he was shopping information, gauging what kind of protection he could secure by turning on rivals or corrupt officials. Others argue that Edgar's pride wouldn't allow such a compromise. So what do you think? Was Barbie the type to strike a deal? Or was he too bound by the cartel code to betray anyone? As the extradition loomed, Edgar's thoughts often turned to his family. He wondered how they were coping with the constant media coverage of his case, whether they had managed to shield themselves from the worst of it. He felt guilt for the danger his notoriety might have brought them, but also a fierce desire to keep them out of his legal battles. He instructed his attorneys to maintain a buffer, limiting the government's ability to use his family as leverage. Within the walls of the detention facility, Edgar became an enigmatic figure. Some inmates regarded him with awe, whispering about the legend of Barbie, while others viewed him with suspicion, wary of his reputation for violence and power. Edgar stayed detached, polite but distant, careful not to form bonds that could later be used against him. He understood that prison politics were their own minefield. The extradition finally came in late 2015 after years of legal maneuvering. U.S. Marshals arrived at the Mexican facility in the early hours of the morning. Edgar, dressed in plain prison clothes, was shackled and led to a waiting plane. He didn't struggle or protest. He knew resistance was pointless. The plane lifted off, and with it, the last tangible ties to the country where he had built his empire disappeared beneath him. When the aircraft touched down in the United States, Edgar stepped onto American soil for the first time in years, surrounded by heavily armed marshals. He was booked into a federal holding facility where the conditions were even stricter than those in Mexico. No press conferences this time. No cameras capturing his smile. Here, he was simply another defendant awaiting trial, albeit one whose name carried headlines. The charges laid out against Edgar were exhaustive. Prosecutors accused him of importing massive quantities of narcotics, laundering millions of dollars, and orchestrating violence on both sides of the border. Conviction would almost certainly mean life behind bars. Edgar listened to the charges calmly, nodding occasionally, but offering no reaction beyond the occasional raised eyebrow. In the quiet of his new cell, Edgar thought about what lay ahead. He knew the U.S. government would offer him one opportunity: cooperate and possibly reduce his sentence, or refuse and face the full weight of the law. It was a choice that cut to the core of who he was. One night, after his attorney laid out the grim odds, Edgar leaned back on his cot and murmured, "I've lived my whole life by my choices. I guess this is no different." The American legal system moved at a different pace than the world Edgar Valdez Villarreal had once commanded. Gone were the rapid-fire decisions, the adrenaline-fueled escapes, and the sense of control that had defined his years as Barbie. Now he was a federal inmate in the custody of the U.S. Marshals, his life defined by hearings, motions, and deadlines dictated by prosecutors and judges. Edgar's presence in the United States drew significant media attention. The man once known for his violent enforcement and polished charisma was now photographed entering courtrooms in an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled, a far cry from the tailored suits he had favored in Mexico. Reporters chronicled every appearance, speculating on whether he would cooperate with prosecutors or maintain the cartel code of silence. Behind the scenes, the U.S. government assembled a formidable case. Agents from the DEA, FBI, and Homeland Security had compiled years of evidence, wiretaps, surveillance photos, seized drug shipments, and testimony from former associates who had already flipped. The scale of Edgar's alleged operations was staggering. Thousands of kilograms of cocaine, millions of dollars laundered through elaborate networks, and a trail of violence stretching from Texas to Mexico. One mainstream historical fact highlights just how high the stakes were. U.S. prosecutors were known for securing life sentences for cartel leaders with few opportunities for parole. Convicted traffickers often disappeared into the vast federal prison system, destined to spend the rest of their lives in isolation. Edgar was acutely aware of this reality, and it weighed heavily on every decision he made. Many people still think that Edgar's next move would determine his legacy. Should he cooperate and potentially reduce his sentence, even if it meant betraying former allies? Or should he remain silent, embracing the near certainty of life in prison? So, what do you think? Was Barbie capable of turning on the underworld he had once helped rule? Or was he too bound by his own sense of loyalty and pride? Edgar's attorneys presented him with options, but none of them were appealing. Cooperation could bring a lighter sentence, but it also painted a target on his back for the rest of his life. Remaining silent meant decades, possibly life, behind bars. Edgar weighed the choices carefully, speaking at length with his legal team, but revealing little about his intentions. He had always been a strategist, and this was the most consequential calculation of his life. In the holding facility, Edgar adapted to the rhythms of American incarceration. He kept to himself, avoiding conflicts with other inmates, though his reputation inevitably preceded him. Some prisoners approached him with respect, drawn by the legend of Barbie, while others viewed him as a potential source of trouble. Edgar remained polite but distant, understanding that prison politics could be just as dangerous as the streets. He also spent time reviewing the prosecution's evidence. Boxes of documents and digital files detailed his alleged crimes in painstaking detail. Edgar read them methodically, searching for weaknesses in the case. He knew that even if he chose to fight the charges, the odds of prevailing were slim. The U.S. government's resources were immense, and they were determined to make an example of him. At night, alone in his cell, Edgar often thought about his family. He wondered if they would ever visit, if they even wanted to. He thought about the life he had once envisioned as a young man in Laredo, before the cartel world had consumed him. Those thoughts were fleeting, though. Edgar had long ago learned to bury regret deep. One evening, his attorney delivered a stark message. Prosecutors were prepared to offer a deal, but it required full cooperation. Edgar listened quietly, nodding as the details were laid out. He didn't commit one way or the other, but when the attorney left, Edgar sat on the edge of his cot for a long time, staring at the wall. He had always believed he could navigate any situation, find the angle that would let him come out ahead. But now, the choices before him all led to a future defined by confinement. For the first time, Edgar faced a reality he couldn't charm, outmaneuver, or intimidate his way through. And yet, even in that moment, a trace of the old Barbie remained. He straightened his posture, brushed back his blonde hair, and muttered to himself, "I'll figure it out. I always do." As the months rolled into years, Edgar Valdez Villarreal's trial drew closer. The machinery of the U.S. justice system moved slowly but steadily, compiling a mountain of evidence that painted a vivid picture of Barbie's rise and fall. For prosecutors, the case was about more than just one man. It was about making a statement that no cartel leader, no matter how powerful or notorious, was beyond the reach of American law. Edgar watched this unfold from the confines of a federal detention center. His days were monotonous: early wake-ups, head counts, meals eaten in a crowded cafeteria, and hours spent in his cell reviewing legal documents. He remained composed, rarely displaying frustration or fear, but he understood the gravity of what was coming. A guilty verdict could mean spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. His attorneys pushed him to consider a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, they explained, and prosecutors were likely to pursue the harshest sentence possible. If he cooperated, he could potentially shave years, even decades, off his time. But cooperation came with a price. It would mean betraying people he had known for years, some of whom still commanded immense power inside and outside prison walls. One mainstream historical fact highlights the risk Edgar faced. High-profile cartel informants often became targets of assassination, even in U.S. custody. Networks of loyalists could reach across borders, and Edgar knew that if he was perceived as a traitor, his life, and possibly the lives of his family, would be in danger. Many people still think that Edgar's pride and sense of loyalty made it impossible for him to cooperate. Others believe he may have offered information behind closed doors, hoping to secure leniency without publicizing his cooperation. So what do you think? Was Barbie bound by his code, or was he willing to play the government's game if it meant survival? While Edgar considered his options, the remnants of the Beltran Leyva organization continued to disintegrate. Rival cartels had absorbed much of its territory, and the men who had once called themselves his allies were scattered. Some were in prison, others were dead, and a few had faded into obscurity, trying to escape their past lives. Edgar's name still carried weight in the press, but in the underworld, it was increasingly irrelevant. He spent hours each day preparing with his attorneys, going over the government's evidence line by line. Wiretap transcripts, financial records, testimony from former associates. All of it painted a damning portrait. Edgar was struck by how thoroughly the authorities had tracked his activities. Every phone call, every trip, every cash transaction seemed to be documented. He thought back to the times he had felt untouchable, the times he believed he was always one step ahead, and realized how wrong he had been. In the evenings, he would sometimes walk the narrow corridor outside his cell, flanked by guards, and think about the life he had left behind. He remembered the mansions in Acapulco, the armored convoys, the roar of the ocean during parties at his beachside villas. He remembered Arturo Beltran Leyva, the man who had once been his mentor, and wondered if Arturo would have survived longer than he had. Those memories were bittersweet, reminders of the world he had built and lost. As his trial date neared, Edgar began to sense the inevitability of a guilty plea. Fighting the charges outright would be a gamble with odds so poor they bordered on hopeless. A plea could offer at least a glimmer of a future outside prison walls, even if that future was decades away. He asked his attorneys to explore the terms, listening intently as they explained what cooperation might entail. He gave no answer, but the fact that he was asking was telling. One night, after a long strategy session, Edgar lay awake in his cell, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his family, the few people he still cared about, and what his choices would mean for them. He thought about the men he had led, the lives he had taken, and the empire he had commanded. And he thought about how quickly power had slipped through his fingers, leaving him here, in a place where even his name meant little. He turned on his side, closed his eyes, and whispered softly, "It's just another game, and I have to play it." By early 2016, Edgar Valdez Villarreal's path through the U.S. legal system had crystallized into a familiar outcome, a plea deal. The evidence arrayed against him was immense, and his attorneys had made it clear that a full trial would almost certainly result in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. A guilty plea, however, might secure a small measure of mercy, perhaps a finite prison term that, even if long, would at least give him the hope of release one day. Edgar knew what this meant. Accepting a plea was tantamount to admitting defeat, a bitter pill for a man who had spent his life projecting strength and control. Yet he was also a realist. The odds were stacked too high, the government's case too airtight. He agreed to plead guilty to charges of cocaine trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. The day of the plea hearing was unlike anything Edgar had ever experienced. He entered the federal courtroom in shackles, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, his blonde hair now flecked with gray. Gone was the polished figure once photographed in designer suits at cartel gatherings. The man standing before the judge was leaner, quieter, but still carried himself with the same upright posture that had once inspired both loyalty and fear. The judge asked him a series of questions, confirming that he understood the charges, the rights he was waiving, and the penalties he faced. Edgar answered each question in a measured tone, showing no emotion. When the judge finally asked how he pleaded, he responded simply, "Guilty, Your Honor." One mainstream historical fact underscores the severity of his plea. U.S. sentencing guidelines for trafficking in the volumes attributed to Edgar often recommend decades in prison, even without additional charges of violence. For a figure of his notoriety, the court was unlikely to show leniency. Many people still think that Edgar's guilty plea was purely pragmatic, a move to minimize his sentence. Others believe it was a recognition that the life he had led was unsustainable, that his time as Barbie had come to its natural conclusion. So, what do you think? Was this the act of a man calculating his odds, or was it a rare moment of acceptance? Following his plea, Edgar was transferred to a federal prison in the United States to await sentencing. The facility was remote, heavily guarded, and designed to house high-profile inmates. Life there was austere and unforgiving. Days were defined by strict schedules, head counts, meals, limited outdoor exercise, and long stretches in his cell. Edgar, accustomed to luxury and constant movement, adapted with the same quiet discipline he had displayed since his capture. He kept to himself, avoiding the cliques and hierarchies that defined prison culture. His notoriety made him both a curiosity and a potential target. But Edgar's reputation for decisiveness deterred most from testing him. He spent his time reading, writing letters, and exercising to maintain his health. He understood that his sentencing hearing could still be months away, and he needed to be mentally prepared. At night, Edgar would sometimes replay his life in his mind. He thought about Laredo, about his high school football days, and the choices that had set him on a path toward the cartels. He remembered Arturo Beltran Leyva, the rise of the BLO, the wealth and power that had once seemed limitless. And he remembered the fall, the arrests, the betrayals, the steady erosion of everything he had built. He wondered how history would remember him. Would he be another cautionary tale? A footnote in the bloody chronicles of Mexico's drug war? Or would the legend of Barbie, the American who had cut heads in Mexico, endure? These questions lingered, unanswered, as he lay on his thin prison mattress and stared at the ceiling. The sentencing hearing would come soon enough, and with it, the final judgment on the life he had led. Until then, Edgar waited, carrying himself with the same composure he had shown at every turn. He knew that once the sentence was pronounced, whatever it might be, there would be no more moves left to play. The sentencing hearing of Edgar Valdez Villarreal in January 2018 was a culmination of everything the U.S. Justice Department had worked toward for over a decade. The courtroom was packed. Federal prosecutors, agents who had pursued Barbie for years, journalists hungry for a headline, and a few family members who had come to witness the end of a saga that had spilled blood and shattered communities on both sides of the border. Edgar was brought in wearing a khaki prison uniform, shackled at the wrists and ankles. He looked older, leaner, but still carried that familiar aura of composure. His blonde hair had faded slightly, and lines etched deeper around his eyes, but he stood tall. Those who knew him from his days of wealth and power would have noticed the subtle shift, still confident, but with the air of someone who understood that his control over life had slipped away. The prosecution presented a devastating narrative. They outlined how Edgar had smuggled massive quantities of cocaine and other drugs into the United States, orchestrated violence in Mexico, and laundered millions of dollars. Witnesses, including former cartel associates, testified about his ruthlessness and his calculated approach to building his empire. They spoke of decapitated rivals, armored convoys, and the fear his name evoked across border towns. One mainstream historical fact put his empire into perspective. At its height, the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, was responsible for smuggling an estimated 50 tons of cocaine annually into the United States. Prosecutors argued that Edgar was a key architect of that system and deserved the maximum sentence allowed by law. Many people still think that Edgar's demeanor during the proceedings was enigmatic. He listened intently, occasionally leaning in to whisper to his attorneys, but he never appeared rattled. Was this quiet defiance a refusal to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing fear? Or was it the resignation of a man who knew the outcome was already written? So what do you think? Was Barbie still playing the part? Or had he finally accepted the reality of his fate? When it was Edgar's turn to address the court, he spoke briefly. His voice was calm, measured. He expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused, but did not offer excuses. "I made choices," he said simply, "and I will live with those choices." There was no melodrama, no attempt at self-pity, just the same matter-of-fact tone that had carried him through years of survival. The judge sentenced him to 49 years in federal prison. The number, nearly half a century, was effectively a life sentence for a man already in his mid-40s. The courtroom was silent for a moment as the words sank in. Edgar nodded slightly, showing no visible reaction, then allowed marshals to lead him away. After sentencing, Edgar was transferred to a high-security federal penitentiary. The facility was designed to hold the most dangerous and high-profile inmates in the system. Life there was even more regimented than in the detention centers he had previously known. Hours in solitary confinement, limited interaction with other prisoners, and constant monitoring became his reality. In the quiet of his new cell, Edgar thought about the years stretching endlessly ahead. He wondered about his family, about whether they would visit, and about the outside world that would continue to change without him. He thought, too, about his old life, the power, the violence, the choices that had led him here. One night, after the final lights out, Edgar lay awake listening to the distant hum of the prison's ventilation system. He whispered to himself, "This is my world now." It wasn't resignation so much as recognition. He had built an empire out of ambition and risk, and now he would spend the rest of his life living with the consequences. For Edgar Valdez Villarreal, La Barbie, the journey that began on the football fields of Laredo and wound through the blood-soaked corridors of Mexico's drug war had reached its inevitable conclusion. The game was over, and the pieces were scattered. Life in a high-security federal penitentiary was a far cry from the chaos of Edgar Valdez Villarreal's cartel days, but it was no less dangerous. The prison, often referred to by inmates as a concrete tomb, housed some of the most notorious criminals in the United States. There was no escaping the constant hum of surveillance cameras, the echo of metal doors slamming shut, or the unrelenting isolation. Edgar's days became a study in routine. He woke early to the blare of an electronic buzzer, stood for roll call, and ate breakfast in silence before returning to his cell. The hours were structured with precision: limited recreation time in a small caged yard, brief showers, and occasional library visits. Conversation was rare, and trust was non-existent. Edgar had learned long ago that in environments like this, showing weakness or even too much friendliness could be fatal. He adapted with the same quiet discipline he had used to survive in the streets. He kept his cell immaculate, exercised religiously, and read whatever books he could get his hands on: history, crime novels, even self-help guides. He wrote letters to his attorneys and occasionally to family members, though he rarely received replies. He knew the notoriety of his name made it difficult for them to stay connected. His arrest and conviction had cast a long shadow over anyone tied to him. One mainstream historical fact demonstrates the broader reality of prison life for cartel leaders. Many high-profile inmates are held under special administrative measures that severely restrict communication to prevent them from coordinating criminal activity from behind bars. Edgar was no exception. Phone calls were monitored, visits were rare and conducted behind glass, and any outgoing mail was scrutinized by federal authorities. Many people still think that prison life must have been unbearable for a man like Edgar, who once commanded fleets of armored SUVs and lived in seaside mansions. But others argue that his adaptability, the same quality that had kept him alive in Mexico, would allow him to endure even these conditions. So, what do you think? Was La Barbie broken by the monotony of prison, or did he find a way to maintain the iron composure that had always defined him? Inside the prison, Edgar was both respected and feared. Other inmates knew his history and gave him space, but the notoriety also made him a potential target. Edgar remained vigilant, scanning faces for signs of hostility, never letting his guard down. He avoided the prison gangs that dominated the facility, preferring to operate independently. This isolation was lonely, but it reduced the likelihood of becoming entangled in conflicts he couldn't control. In the evenings, Edgar would often pace the narrow strip of concrete that served as his cell's exercise space, lost in thought. He reflected on the empire he had once ruled, the choices that had built it, and the betrayals that had brought it crashing down. He thought about Arturo Beltran Leyva, about the loyalty he had shown and the loyalty he had demanded in return, and he wondered if, in the end, loyalty had ever truly existed in the world he had inhabited. There were moments of introspection, even regret, but Edgar rarely indulged them for long. He had always believed that dwelling on the past was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he focused on surviving each day as it came, carving out a semblance of order in a place designed to strip men of control. One night, as he lay in the darkness of his cell, Edgar listened to the distant clang of a gate closing. He whispered softly, "I've seen worse." It was a reminder to himself that he had endured war zones, betrayals, and near-death encounters. Prison was just another battlefield, and he would navigate it as he always had, with patience, observation, and an unflinching will to survive. Years passed slowly inside the fortress-like walls of Edgar Valdez Villarreal's high-security federal penitentiary. Days bled into one another, the sameness of prison life dulling even the most persistent memories. For Barbie, the former cartel enforcer who had once lived in mansions overlooking Acapulco's beaches, the reality was stark. Narrow corridors, fluorescent lighting, and the endless clank of steel doors sealing the world away. Edgar had learned to adapt, but adaptation did not mean acceptance. He adhered to a disciplined routine that gave structure to the monotony. He woke before dawn, made his bed with military precision, exercised in his cell until sweat dampened the concrete floor, and read for hours at a time. Books became a refuge, each one a temporary escape from the confines of his cell. He favored biographies of leaders, political, military, and criminal, finding parallels between their struggles and his own. Communication with the outside world was rare. Under special administrative measures, his phone calls and visits were heavily restricted, monitored down to the syllable. Letters to family were carefully screened by federal authorities, and while Edgar wrote often, responses came infrequently. He suspected that some relatives wanted nothing to do with him, fearful of the lingering stigma of his name. The silence stung, though he never admitted it aloud. One mainstream historical fact demonstrates just how little connection high-profile inmates like Edgar have to the outside world. Many are prohibited from reading newspapers that reference their own cases, limiting their ability to follow how their legacies are portrayed. For a man like Barbie, whose image had once dominated headlines, this isolation was a deliberate tactic meant to erode ego and influence. Many people still think that Edgar's years in prison must have been a psychological punishment worse than any physical hardship. Others argue that he possessed the mental resilience to withstand even the harshest conditions. So what do you think? Did the silence and isolation gnaw at Barbie's core, or did he find ways to harden himself against it? Within the prison walls, Edgar maintained a reputation that commanded quiet respect. He wasn't openly feared the way some prison gang leaders were, but his history was well known, and few inmates dared to test him. He carried himself with a calm detachment that suggested he was always observing, always calculating. If trouble arose, Edgar knew how to handle himself, but he preferred to avoid conflict altogether. Prison life was dangerous enough without unnecessary confrontations. The absence of chaos sometimes gave Edgar too much time to think. He replayed the past often, examining choices like a detective poring over evidence. Could he have stepped away earlier? Could he have chosen a different path after Arturo Beltran Leiva's death? These questions surfaced in the quiet hours, but Edgar rarely allowed them to linger. Regret was a luxury he couldn't afford, even now. In 2020, word filtered through the prison system about a new global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. Facilities like Edgar's were placed on even stricter lockdowns, cutting off what little movement and interaction inmates once had. He spent weeks in near-total isolation, confined to his cell nearly 24 hours a day. The days felt longer, the silence heavier. But Edgar endured. He had endured worse. By 2021, the rhythms of the prison resumed, albeit slowly. Edgar remained focused on survival. He avoided prison gangs, stayed in good standing with guards, and adhered strictly to the rules. These measures didn't make him comfortable, but they reduced the risk of unnecessary punishment or danger. One evening, after a rare hour in the prison yard, Edgar sat in his cell and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his old life, the luxury, the violence, the sense of untouchable power, and how distant it felt now. "It's all gone," he muttered softly, almost to himself. Then he rolled onto his side, closed his eyes, and reminded himself of the same mantra he had carried through the darkest moments of his life. Survive today. Worry about tomorrow when it comes. The years after Edgar Valdez Villarreal's sentencing stretched into a long and unbroken horizon, one that even his disciplined mind sometimes struggled to face. By 2023, Edgar was deep into his 49-year sentence, confined in one of the United States' most secure federal prisons. Each day was a replica of the one before. Head counts, meals taken in silence, short bouts of exercise in stark concrete yards, and long hours alone in his cell. For Barbie, once a man accustomed to constant movement and luxury, prison life had become the ultimate test of endurance. His notoriety had faded from public view. News outlets no longer splashed his name across headlines, and the cartels that had once feared and respected him had moved on. The drug trade was as violent and profitable as ever, but it no longer revolved around figures like Edgar Valdez Villarreal. In the world outside, new leaders had risen, new alliances had formed, and Barbie had become another ghost of the past. One mainstream historical fact illustrates this reality. In Mexico, between 2020 and 2023, new generations of cartel leaders emerged from groups like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, eclipsing older organizations like the Beltran Leyva organization. Edgar's name, once synonymous with power, had little relevance to the younger operatives running today's operations. Many people still think about whether Edgar reflects on this fading legacy. Some believe he must struggle with the knowledge that his empire was dismantled, his name forgotten by those who once invoked it in fear. Others argue that Edgar has made peace with his reality, accepting that survival, day by day, is the only goal left. So what do you think? Does Barbie still hold on to the idea of legacy? Or has he learned to live without it? Within the prison, Edgar's life was defined by small routines. He kept his cell organized, wrote occasional letters to family, and read voraciously. He had built a mental fortress, a way of compartmentalizing his thoughts to prevent despair from creeping in. He rarely spoke of the past, even to the few inmates he trusted, but those who knew him said he carried himself with a calm resignation. He was not broken, but he was no longer the man who had once wielded fear like a weapon. Edgar's thoughts often returned to his family in the United States. He wondered how they were doing, whether they thought of him, and if they could ever forgive the choices that had led him here. He wrote letters he never sent, reflecting on his childhood in Laredo, the ambitions that had propelled him into the cartel world, and the cost of chasing power. These private writings were his way of preserving a piece of himself in a world that sought to erase him. One night, as Edgar lay awake on his narrow cot, he listened to the distant hum of the prison's ventilation system. He thought about the men he had led, the life he had built, and the empire that had crumbled in his absence. He knew there would be no escape, no miraculous twist of fate that would undo his sentence. But he also knew that surrender was not in his nature. Survive today, worry about tomorrow when it comes. It was the same mantra he had repeated through the cartel wars, through the betrayals, and now through the endless monotony of prison life. Edgar closed his eyes and took a slow, steady breath. The world outside had moved on, but in the quiet of his cell, he remained unbroken. Whatever history chose to remember of Barbie, whether as a cautionary tale, a footnote, or a legend, he would face it as he always had, head on without flinching. And now, as the story of Edgar Valdez Villarreal drifts into the dim corridors of history, it's time to let the world outside your window fade away as well. Imagine the hum of distant air, steady and constant, like the rhythm of your own heartbeat. The walls around you feel softer, the edges of the day gently dissolving into shadow. There is no rush anymore, no need to think of the past or the future, just the quiet comfort of this moment. The noise of the world is distant now, muted like a far-off echo. The only thing that matters is the slow rise and fall of your breath, warm and even. Every inhale pulls in peace, and every exhale carries away whatever tension is left behind. The story you've just heard may have been filled with conflict, ambition, and consequences, but those things belong to another life, far from where you are now. Allow yourself to let go, just as Edgar was eventually forced to let go, of control, of the past, of what might have been. There's nothing left to solve tonight. The journey is complete, and you are safe. Feel the weight of your body sink deeper into where you rest. Your eyelids grow heavy, your muscles loosen, and the last threads of wakefulness slip quietly through your fingers. If stray thoughts come, let them drift by like leaves on a slow-moving river. There is no need to hold on to them. You are exactly where you are meant to be, and the night is patient. Let it wrap around you like a blanket, soft and sure, until sleep finds you, gentle and deep.